Welcome to the Art of Conscious Living TV. I have a very special guest today, Ken Snyder. He is a teacher of Nonviolent Communication, NVC. It's a way of connecting to what is alive in you, connecting with the empathy in you and the compassion in you to speak with others. And I'm so very pleased to have him here via Skype from the East Coast of USA. So let's take a moment to speak with him and to enjoy his great wisdom that he has. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Good to be here, Victoria. I appreciate all your efforts and your whole crew there in making this happen.
Well, thank you. So how are you at this moment in time?
I'm doing quite well. I had a wonderful day and just kind of taking a moment to meditate and connect with myself here and connect with you all there, and really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we must say right from the very beginning that we have just lost the founder of Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg. So we must pay great homage to him. He just passed on within the last 30 days at a ripe age of in his late 70s. And let's talk about him, of who he was and the man that developed this incredible program that's known as, affectionately known as Nonviolent Communication, NVC. So he started in Detroit. That's where his story started. And can you pick up, Ken, from there?
Well, the way he tells it, the way I understand it, he was greatly affected by violence that he saw in the city all around him, and he, really became a guiding force in his life to understand, what created this in people, and so he decided to become a psychologist, and in his studies, he learned to diagnose people and to understand people in that way, labeling and categorizing, but he found some discontent in that, and so he was really driven out of his need to really understand people deeply, to develop this process of nonviolent communication, which is very different from traditional psychological orientations of diagnosis and labeling. It's oriented toward just really connecting directly with what's alive in people, as you so eloquently stated. So that was really the driving principle in what allowed him to develop this method. He talks kind of humorously about his frustrations with psychiatry and psychology in doing evaluations, having to write up evaluations. And when I heard him say that, I really identified with that myself as an occupational therapist, is my profession. And it is one of the things that I am least fond of in the profession is writing things up and evaluating people.
What was remarkable about him is that he went against the total grain of what everybody else was doing, and more so even today, where it's all about medicating people, to dummy them down, to make them so they don't feel what they're feeling, because what they're feeling is known as a negative. So they're feeling negative emotions, they're feeling depression, they're feeling an angst. So in saying that, he wanted to go and take a different approach. His approach was, well, let's talk about that. Let's separate your needs from your emotions. And he isolated what needs are. A lot of times people get lost in their emotions, and they're very untouched with their needs. So let's speak about needs versus emotions.
Well, this is one of the things I really find so wonderful about nonviolent communication. He has boiled things down so simply, so you don't get distracted with a lot of thoughts and interpretations. And I want to back up just a moment too, because something I would also like to share is how we developed nonviolent communication. He describes it as really a combination of Carl Rogers' work, which most people may be familiar with as client-centered therapy, or conventionally people will say speaking in the I. So it's really focused on oneself and what's alive in the moment. It's a very present-centered process. And the genius of it, as far as I'm concerned, is he boils it down to simply 4 components. And so the most basic sense, it's a set of skills that involve objective observations, identifying feelings, identifying needs, and making requests of ourselves and others. So that, in the most basic form, is where we focus our attention.
Yes, and a moment ago you mentioned that not to interpret what somebody is saying, not to be judging what they're saying, not to be guessing what they're saying. So there's a lot of inquiry going on. Let's give an example of what that would be like. For instance, as I'm speaking right now, and I say something, then instead of you being in the judgment mode, now we're going to talk about the giraffe and the Jekyll now. So let's talk about that. So where the Jekyll, well, I'll set that up as a giraffe and Jekyll. You explain what that is, and we'll see how the Jekyll can be interpreting and judging what people are saying, where the giraffe is not doing that. Okay. So let's give an example of that so the audience really knows what we're speaking about. What is a giraffe and what is a Jekyll?
Yeah, I'd like to start with that. I mean, because they're really, metaphors, and they're fun, playful ways of demonstrating to people the concept of ways we can choose to focus our attention. So the Jekyll essentially represents a way of blaming or judging ourselves or others, and we can focus that quality of attention inward toward ourselves or outward toward other people. So it would result in thoughts about other people, evaluations, judgments, labels, blaming, criticism, things of that nature, whereas the giraffe represents another alternative or option we have for how to focus our consciousness. Again, we can focus inward on ourselves or outward to other people, but this attempts to connect, we'll say, with the heart, with people's life energy, and in the language of nonviolent communication, we call this feelings and needs. It's really life energy in the body and the shape and form it takes and how we express ourselves. But it's more direct quality of connection with what's alive in the present moment without the thoughts getting in the way. And that's what I so love about this process, because we can get really caught up in the thoughts and we're off to the races, and that's just another whole abstract place that isn't what's going on right here, right now, between you and I.
So let's say a Jekyll would be in the judgment mode and not taking responsibility, where a giraffe would be looking at what is alive in the other person. So what would the dialogue be? What would be the main difference? Let's take a hypothetical, as if a mother was having a conversation with her teenage daughter. And the teenage daughter is wanting something, and the mother is not wanting that for her. She's not agreeing with that. So the Jekyll would do what? Let's say the mother was the Jekyll. What would that sound like?
Well, we actually get even more specific than that, because in this process, we're not generalizing about anything. We take a specific observation, that is something we can literally see or hear, something we experience in the moment with our senses. So rather than just saying the daughter wants something, what is it that we hear the daughter say or do, very specifically? If we want to deal with an example.
Okay.
Do you have an example for me?
Well, let's just do a hypothetical of that.
Well, but we don't. That's exactly the thing. We don't deal in hypotheticals. What we deal with is what's alive in the present moment. So we don't talk in the abstract and we don't generalize. We need to actually hear something, a stimulus.
Okay, so let's talk in real time, because I know I have the pleasure and honor to be speaking with you in the last months on a one-to-one. So let's give an example of that. So right in this moment in real time, the example of that, the Jekyll. Let's give an example of a Jekyll now. You being the Jekyll now, okay? So I being the person who's trying to make myself understood now, and to give an example, and I'm not knowing if you are understanding me. So what would the Jekyll do?
You would like to know if I'm understanding what you're asking?
Yes. And what would how would a Jekyll answer back to me?
I'm a little puzzled with the.
Just go with the flow, Ken. We do it
Oh,
many times during the week for the last
okay.
month. So,
So
uh,
you're asking me just to judge you and criticize you.
yes,
Is that what?
yes.
Okay.
I'm not knowing if you're understanding me now. We're doing a role play right now. So I'm not
Right.
knowing if you're understanding me. So what would the Jekyll be doing?
Jack would be criticizing. The jackal would be judging you, running away with its
No, no, be
thoughts.
in real time. So do it.
Yep. So you want me to scold you or blame you for something?
Yes, I want you to be
Okay.
in real time with it. Feel what we're doing here. So what I'm saying to you is, I'm not sure, Ken, if you're understanding me, obviously. So be the Jekyll now.
Okay. I'm understanding you're wanting me to blame or criticize you, and I'm not quite sure how to go about doing that. I'm not sure what it is you're wanting me to
I'm
blame or
not sure if
criticize.
you understand me. So are you understanding me?
You're wanting me to be a jackal.
Yes.
Boy, that woman, she's asking these ridiculous questions of me, and that's not what I want to be talking about, and I don't understand what she's saying, and I wish she would say it differently. How's
Okay.
that?
All right. So Jekyll, um, how could I say it differently? In nonviolent communication, I would now try to drop down into my aliveness of myself and try to find out what's going on with you right now, Ken, that you need to be the Jekyll. Gave a very good example. It was all very accusing and judging and not taking responsibility a moment ago. So now we're going to give an example of what a draft would be doing now that I'm connecting with you and I'm knowing you're understanding me.
Well, I'm wanting to understand that you have a need for understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to guess that maybe are you feeling frustrated at the moment, or how are you feeling?
I'm not feeling frustrated. I'm feeling very calm, very relaxed, and I would like to connect with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to know that you understand me and that you can follow through with giving the examples for the viewers that they could really understand what a difference between a Jekyll and a draft would be. So we're giving a clear example so they can see that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're wanting an example, and you're wanting to have people understand more clearly what it is to connect directly with what's alive in you and myself.
And with
Would you
each
like?
other.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they can do the same thing and they'll be able to do it with their children, their friends, their loved ones, their husband, their wife. They will be able to take that example that we are offering.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay. So you asked me to basically blame and criticize you, and now you would like me to simply identify what needs you have at this moment, and you're simply asking
yes,
for an example
yes. How
so
would a
that
draft? How would a draft let me know that I'm being understood?
draft lets you know you're being understood by giving you an example of draft.
Or being the draft right now.
Mm-hmm. So
So
you're
doing
making a request.
yes.
You're making a request, and your need is for your audience to enhance your audience's understanding of the process of nonviolent communication.
Well, I'm going to take this as an exercise the last 10 minutes that we can see that the human language is not perfect. And you and I are trying to get on track of doing something, but it's taking us time to do that, to acclimate with that. So if we're having that concern, can you imagine what's going on here with people? Sometimes it sounds like people are talking Chinese to each other and they don't understand each other. They have needs to be met, they have feelings to be expressed, but they're not really feeling they're getting that accomplished. So let's move forward on this and talk more about the needs and the emotions of what that's all about.
Well, again, I outlined the process of nonviolent communication for you in terms of the four components. So we always apply it in the moment with exactly what's being said or experienced. And we separate the stimulus from our thoughts about the stimulus, because the feelings are created by our thoughts. So if something happens, if there's something that's said to us that stimulates a thought, we have feelings about it, and it may open up a gap for a need that we have. So it's really a matter of connecting with that, and in ourselves and other people. When you talk about emotions, emotions isn't even part of the nomenclature of nonviolent communication, because emotions is a combination of thoughts and feelings and needs. So as I started to begin with, part of the wonderful aspect of this is it takes all of that out of it.
So when we speak about connecting with what is alive in each other, what's alive in the other, let's really talk more about that, what that means.
Well, as I said, it's about life energy. It could be feelings and needs. What's alive presently.
Right. And it's also with the emphasis on the positive opposed to the negative. Like, if one is looking at what is wrong with the other person, then in essence, they're not really looking at what's alive in them. So when I say what's alive, I'm seeing it and knowing it as what is beautiful in the other person, what is positive in them, how can I establish a connection to them, quite simply, a heartfelt connection.
It's interesting because there is what we'll call an architecture of language, a linguistic architecture. And what I mean by that is Marshall would talk about how we've been educated to think and perceive has come from king-dominated invader cultures, right, whose motive was to really divide and conquer, to separate people from one another and from ourselves. So even the language of good and bad, right or wrong, positive and negative, these things are so embedded in how we think and perceive that it's challenging to even perceive, let alone speak, in a way that's connected to life. Because we are thinking and perceiving and speaking through this medium that we've been given. So we see these, as he would say, enemy images of people, and we see, oh, that's good, that's bad, this is right, this is wrong. So when you talk positive and negative, you don't even think in terms of positive and negative emotions, that if we have genuine sadness, if we have just lost something that's really precious to us, then sadness, mourning, a need for mourning, we'll even sometimes talk about as a celebration of mourning, in that when we're fully connected with our sadness and mourning, it tells us that there was something really precious that we value, that we love. So we want to really connect with that and the value of that and how that enhances life.
Right.
So it's really about authenticity.
Well, let's take that what you just spoke about, where if there is sadness and mourning, then that could be looked upon as being negative, but in essence, it's not to look upon as negative. It's to celebrate that the person is embracing their feelings and to connect to them and to support them with that.
Authentic connection to what's alive, right? And so if we're able to be there with someone who's in mourning and not handing them a tissue or, pacifying them and telling them it'll be all right and really denying or minimizing their feelings, that would perhaps prevent a person from fully experiencing, right, what's truly and authentically alive in them at that moment. What's truly important to them, and that the expression of that.
So let's speak about before you knew about nonviolent communication, what your life was like, and now that you have been totally embracing the nonviolent communication methodology in your life, what is it like? What's the main differences of your relationships with others?
Well, historically, before nonviolent communication, I'm much like anyone else, and I've had joys and sorrows and frustrations, and had been educated, like most people in this culture, to project and express outward my frustrations, or even joys. That when we talk about positive and negative, we realize that they're both judgments, right? And they're judgments attributing how we're feeling to things outside ourselves. When we say that's good or that's bad or that's positive or that's negative, we also have a choice of saying, you know, when I feel or experience that thing out there, whatever it might be, I feel a certain way because a certain need is met. And so it isn't the fault, or I don't give credit to that thing outside myself as much as recognize it's a stimulus for what is inside me. Right? We talk about the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So two people can look at the same thing, experience the same stimulus, and have two very different experiences.
So give me a real example of what it would have been like of dealing with others, perhaps an ex-girlfriend, an ex-friend, or friends in the past, before you even heard about nonviolent communication.
Well, I think when there's conflict, the tendency, as we've been taught, is to blame. So we look for fault outside ourselves. So I would imagine, I'm having a hard time coming with a specific example here, talk about ex-girlfriends or relationships where there's conflicts, but typically we would identify something that the person did or said that was right or wrong, that was hurtful. You know, we attribute some kind of blame to what other people have done. And the idea of speaking in the eye, connecting with oneself, and then sharing that with people is really this idea of making oneself vulnerable. So for me, that would be, I think, a significant change prior and after having learned some of these skills. Not just a willingness to be more vulnerable, but actually a bit of a joy, you know, really enjoying the process of sharing what's, you know, authentically going on inside me. That might not have been something that I would have done as readily.
That is a major key factor here of the vulnerability. So thank you for bringing that up. Now, with vulnerability becomes the liveness within you, becomes the responsibility within you. Life becomes more precious and more fuller with the vulnerability. Vulnerability brings in curiosity, brings in many possibilities, as opposed to being the opposite of that, of being guarded, judgmental, being righteous. Those ways are not bringing in possibilities, not allowing the possibilities to flow between each other.
The example I give is, have you ever asked someone for directions and gotten a response that, go away, you bother me, no, I don't want to help you? It's like, people love to contribute to other people, to help other people. So when we ask people for assistance to meet our needs, again, Marshall would put it in terms of asking with what he called a Santa Claus attitude. You know, you say, ho, 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 you lucky person, let me give you the opportunity to help me. You know, I have this need. Will you help me with this need? So it's very disarming in that respect, right? Because when we come to someone criticizing them, right, what do any of us do, right? It's very challenging, even doing this practice, and it really is a practice. You know, it's very simple to get the concepts. You can do it in an hour and you think, I got the concepts down. And then you can spend the rest of your life practicing these things, particularly when emotions are high, needs are pressing, you know, and there's a stressful situation and two people, you know, who's going to go first? Who's going to get the needs first, met first? So to be able to open up in that way to another person, and rather than criticizing, just sharing how you're feeling, what you're needing right now, it's very disarming. People are attracted to that, right?
Well,
we're all attracted to that.
Do you have some tips to offer when people are first learning about it, knowing about it, and now they're practicing it, and they may fall back in their own patterns. So a few tips could be to, for instance, an example of a tip could be to slow down and breathe. Take a few breaths and connect with your heart before you speak. Don't be so quick to speak and answer back to people. Take that moment to really quiet yourself down. What other tips would you offer?
First one that came to mind is don't try this with your family for at least a year. Because it really, and of course I said that jokingly, and yet, there's truth in it, right? Because we have these long established patterns with family members. So there's some particularly intractable sorts of patterns that are quite daunting. So you want to practice with little things first. That would be one tip I think I would suggest to
Right.
people. Things where aren't so vitally important, aren't so crucial and life-threatening, really, right?
Right.
Because our connections with family members are long-standing, and they really speak to deep issues and needs for security and safety and love and belonging. So you want to practice with needs when they aren't so pressing and so huge.
Right. That's a very good example. But on the other flip side of that coin would be that Ram Dass said that if you think you're very spiritual and enlightened, then get off of your meditation cushion and go visit your parents for
Well, that's right.
for a day or so,
Right.
and then
Right.
all of those things that you thought that you had mastered on the meditation cushion, how enlightened you are, will all come and be all undone because you'll be with your impatience and with your patterns, as you just pointed out. So that's a very good example, basically to start with neutral people, and then to start with the family members or long-term friends that you are totally fixed with patterns. And then once you get your training wheels on for a while, then you can go to the more of the hardcore patterned, established patterned relationships. And, and try to put some aliveness in there and bring some new, interesting, newer possibilities and newer feelings and perspectives happening there.
Yeah, and there's some really basic skills in terms of feelings. Just the idea of building a vocabulary, having words for feelings. The first course when I took a weekend course with Marshall back in 2004 at Omega Institute, we had a room of about 200 people. People with masters and PhDs and psychologists and everybody from 18 to 98. And it was amazing when he asked people to identify their feelings. People really struggled because, again, the language we've been given, typically many people might say something like, I feel abused, or I feel betrayed. These words that they thought were feelings, but they were really ways of accusing, right? People of they betrayed me. They abused me. Somebody did something to me. And at the very least, people are apt to hear that. Even when we are skillful and have a vocabulary of feelings, and we share feelings, speaking in the I, making ourselves vulnerable, we've also been trained in the same way, not just to speak, but also to hear and listen with the same jackal consciousness. So we may have a habit to listen for blame and judgment. Again, particularly that may be strong in families. If that's one of the patterns that's been established in a family, there's been a history of hurt. People may very well hear blame even when a person isn't intending or even connected with that.
Well, if the person is really establishing and knowing what their needs are, and knowing how to express those needs, then they're not going to perhaps get lost in their feelings. Their feelings are going to be of that way of that you just mentioned, where they're going to start judging the other person or accusing the other person. When they know how to express, the beauty of this nonviolent communication is when you really know how to express quite simply your needs, you're in touch with them, then you're not going to get as emotional. you're not going to be lost into the emotions so much.
Well, that's a big part of the skill, right? So if somebody's coming at us with blame and criticism, and again, it's within a context where perhaps using myself, right, I have some need that's pressing, and I'm wanting to be understood and try to help someone, and then they, are accusing. That's quite challenging, right? To stay connected with your own needs and to hear what need they're expressing through the jackal, right? Because the jackal is just another way of expressing needs, perhaps slightly not as skillfully. So we take it upon ourselves then to connect with the need underneath that critical voice. But you can see how that can be quite a challenging thing. So if you got your own needs pressing and you're trying to connect with someone else's needs while they're criticizing and blaming you, that takes quite a bit of practice. Speaking for myself, it takes quite a bit of practice.
Well, let's get back to Marshall Rosenberg and what his lifelong work was. I know he went into war-torn countries and talked to the political leaders. I know he went into prisons. So let's give me an overview of what his incredible life was like of bringing this to the world.
Well, he's traveled to many countries. Like you said, he did a lot of work in the Middle East. But I guess first and foremost, was the founding of the Center for Nonviolent Communication and the training of other trainers. He did have the foresight and vision to realize that he would not be here forever. He was a human being, and so he wanted to have other people be able to carry on his work and grow these skills and this consciousness in the world. And I think that'll be ultimately his greatest legacy. It's a tremendous community, and it's growing all the time, and it's pervading many circles. The people in healthcare, as you say, in prisons, in diplomacy, politics, every facet of life. He's greatly loved and will be deeply missed by many people, including myself. I have great appreciation for him and his work.
And he's on many different continents and translated into many different languages, the courses of nonviolent communication.
Yeah, being a universal language of life, that's exactly right? It transcends language and culture. It's something that transcends cultures, and that's important to understand. When we talk about universal human needs, that what we mean by universal is that it applies to everyone, everywhere, at every point in time throughout history, wherever you are on the planet. These are needs that we all share, and it's what connects us. And a lot of traditional psychological approaches, needs have been seen at times as an obstacle, right? A weakness. So here, this is a consciousness that appreciates that it is our strength, literally, right? It is our energy, our power, our passion. It's literally what moves us to do everything. We'll say another tip, if you want to call it that, is the recognition that everything we do is in service of needs. Right? We say a modus operandi, somebody's MO, is the thing that moves. It's the thing that moves us. So it is our power, and it is what unites us and what we share.
Why do you think we're so disconnected to our needs as a society? It seems more so now as we advancing more in the technological age of the information age that we're well into now for the last 15 years. There seems to be, that is more prevalent than ever, that people are disconnected from really being able to express themselves. They seem to be lost in a lot of their emotions and their perhaps feelings, or their anger, or their confusion, or conflict, or judgment, or drama, but they're not really there, quite simply expressing their needs. Why are we picking up more with that, do you think, Ken?
Well, it is at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, right? As I mentioned, the way Marshall puts it is that we've been given a way of thinking and perceiving that comes from king-dominated invader cultures. So to the extent that it genuinely is a form of social engineering, right? It's a way of really keeping us separate from ourselves and one another. Today, what I notice, what I've heard other people notice, is this the drumbeat of fear, right? The drumbeat of war, security, so we're very occupied, many people, with a sense of a threat, and this, in terms of social engineering, this is really how you get people to comply if they feel there is a need, such as for security or protection, something as fundamental and basic as that, that is threatened. You can motivate people, right, to align with what they may perceive would meet that need.
So what I'm hearing you say is that when you lose your individuality of your own self and you join the collective, then in doing so, at the sake of your needs are going to be lost within all of that. And then the fear will take place. All you have is fear at that point in time. I know many people in the past have spoke about this. Eric Fromm, The Art of Loving, the great psychologist, Abraham Maslow, about love and what love really is it altruistic love or the love of mother? So the connection I'm trying to make here is when we lose our own purpose, we lose our own individuality of self, then there's a disconnect from our own needs. And perhaps when we have this mindset of joining the collective, where the global connective of social conditioning, then there becomes, in its place, becomes a confusion there of lost in emotions.
Well, what you say brings up a couple of points I'd like to share. One, because we haven't talked about this distinction between a need and a strategy for meeting a need.
Okay.
And so when you talk about a collective, that I think very simply could be understood as a strategy for meeting a need for security. So, and that's part of a social engineering strategy. If I wanted to engineer groups of people, right? And if you want people to feel more connected to other people, you put them in a situation where they're threatened or they need to connect with one another and help one another and cooperate with one another in order to meet that need for security and safety and protection. So the idea of joining a collective is, again, very deeply, it's in our brainstem, in our limbic system, that need for that sense of security. And we are social animals. That's how we've evolved in groups. And so that's deeply connected with our sense of those needs.
Well, the collective I was speaking about was the authority connected to the authority that is there for our security or our well-being, and when we give that over to that, and then they're giving us back fear that they're taking care of us, so therefore we're losing our own dominion of our own individuality in that. And in doing so, there's a disconnect from our own needs there.
Well, two things come to mind as you mentioned that. One is the need for trust. Mm-hmm. And secondly, this idea of loyalty, to, as you're saying, a leader. But implicit in that, what happens too is there is a denial of responsibility, right? That if we give ourselves over to the leader will do it. If we give ourselves over to the group will do it. Instead of recognizing our own needs and making a request of ourselves, for example, what can I do to address this need? And one answer might be that we might come up with is I can join a group, I can join a leader, somebody with more power than me, somebody with more knowledge or information than me. Not right or wrong. There's simply a strategy for getting that need met. Okay,
so a strategy is a a way of thinking through it to come with a result that you would want that is favorable for both parties.
Yeah, ideally, and Marshall would say, the purpose of nonviolent communication, right? Because this is really a process for really teaching empathy. But the way he would put it, it's a way of establishing a quality of connection that allows a natural flow of giving and receiving to occur. So there's a natural flow of energy between people, and so everything becomes a celebration, really. So it's a much more authentic way of living and connecting with ourselves and other people.
All right. Ken, give me an overview of the nonviolent communication from the beginning to the end of all the main points of it. You mentioned about strategy, you mentioned about aliveness, you mentioned about the different components that are with needs opposed to emotions and connecting to those needs and having strategies to connect to those needs. So just give me an overview of it, a very simplified overview.
Yeah, I touched on it. We did touch on it. The simplified overview, the schema, right, is the four components. So the ability to make objective observations without interpretation, judgment, criticism, blame, labeling, categorization, things of that nature. So it's objective observations. And then identifying feelings as they come up. You have a stimulus. We separate stimulus from a thought. We notice the feeling that comes up, and it's really the thought and the need that creates the feeling. So the feelings are important to the extent that they give us a clue to what the needs are, because that's what we really want to connect with. We really want to connect with what's alive, what needs are pressing, or what needs are being met. Right? And we want to enter into that fully. So the capacity to make objective observations, to identify feelings and have a vocabulary of feelings, a growing vocabulary, and then the ability to identify needs. Now, what we've traditionally been taught, right, is we have a need, we're not necessarily very connected with it, talk about it, maybe have some guilt or shame around it, but we go right to strategies. So historically, say we'll have a need, a lot of the language, a lot of the thinking is around, well, what can we do to fix it? What are you going to do? Without ever fully connecting with what the need is in the first place. And that's what gets us to the last piece of this four components is making requests. And it's making requests of ourselves and others. So that's when we get to strategies at that point. But nonviolent communication primarily is about connecting with the needs. We say that once we do that, most conflicts can be addressed relatively easily with the value placed on the field of needs. In other words, not just my needs, but other people's needs. And so I like to say, I no longer enter negotiations with people. It's really just a creativity exercise, right? So we have this field of needs, my needs, your needs, collective needs, a community's needs. What can we do that would best address and serve the needs of everyone involved? Now, we might not get there, very challenging, but just to have that intention to stay connected with the field of needs is nonviolent communication, to have that quality of connection. Now, the requests, you could say, just to finish up here on the general outline, requests have a couple of different natures. I can make a request of myself. I can make a request of another person. And it's really wonderful, this little simple phrase, would you be willing to? And when I was first learning NVC, I'd play with this. I'd be on the phone with a credit card company or my insurance company, and ask, would you be willing to? And it's after making myself vulnerable, being genuine and authentic about how I was feeling and what I was needing, and it asked if they'd be willing to do a little something, and it's amazing.
Give me an example of what that.
Oh, I don't know if I'm going with the exact.
What is that? What would you want them to be willing to do? What?
Remove a charge for something, say.
So it's the way you're saying it to them. You're saying, would you be willing to possibly entertain the thought that you could give me something?
Well, actually, no, we probably wouldn't want to hedge that way, right? We talk about asking with a Santa Claus attitude. So we're giving them a gift because people really do love to contribute to enhancing the quality of our lives, just like we like to do that for other people. So it'd probably be more direct. I would, say, I was not aware this was charged to my credit card, or it was charged, when it wasn't made. And I'm surprised, and I was a little anxious about the charge and being held responsible for it. Would you be willing to remove that? I would really be very grateful if you were to do that.
Very simple and very direct.
Yeah, very simple, very
right.
direct, but authentic, right? And self-connected.
I find it very helpful also when I'm speaking with others for keeping in mind of nonviolent communication, is to check in with them a lot and say, to repeat to them, what do you hear that I just said to you? Or
that would be another of the requests. Yeah.
So if you do that a lot throughout the conversation, asking them what they heard, then you're establishing the fact with the two of you together that you're not interpreting them of what they're saying, and they know that you've heard them, and then you know that you've heard them exactly what they are really saying. And they'll usually say it in a different way. They'll paraphrase it in a different way that really allows that point to be really known. So that's very important. What else could you say? How else could you say it other than saying, is this what I'm hearing you say this, is this correct? How else could you say that?
Well, again, it's the same, would you be willing to? In this case, you're asking for a feeling response, right? So you're wanting to check in to see what your quality connection is with the person. So, and you identified the two major ways we would do that. We could ask, would you be willing to share with me what you heard me say? Because and to let the person know I'm really interested. That's another important point, right? That we really want to cultivate a genuine curiosity, right? Because these are skills, there's components, we can practice them. But if we generally don't care, if we generally aren't interested in what's alive with the other person, we can say all the right things. And that's a typical misnomer, right? People think this is about the language, right? It's about, the words, what you say. It's really about that quality of connection. So it's really about an intention, right? It's really about cultivating a genuine curiosity for what's really going on for the other person and inside myself. So the connecting questions would be, would you be willing to just tell me what you heard me say? Because I really want to be sure that I have a need to be understood, and for understanding, and I would love for you to understand what I'm saying, and vice versa. And also asking how you feel about what you heard me say. Right? So sometimes maybe what they heard us say isn't as important as we say how it landed, how it affected them. Right? So maybe we'll really be concerned about how they're feeling about what they heard. So I may have said specific words, they may have heard something else, but what I'm really concerned about is how they're feeling as a result of what they heard. And how those would be the two questions.
Right, and how they're feeling can be dictated on the fact that they can be emotional about something and they're bringing in their emotions, so therefore they're guarding themselves, so therefore they're not really going to be hearing what you're really saying to them. They're going to be filtering it through the guise of those emotions. So that's why it's very important to check in with them, to establish that what you're saying is in reality really what you are saying, and that they're hearing that. So it's a matter of establishing the connection, I like to say, constantly establishing the connection so there's no dropped connection, and seeing that you have that connection all the time going along.
Yeah, and it can be, as you alluded to earlier, too, very tricky in that you can be impeccable with your language and say specific words, and people may hear a tone, the way you said it, and again, we create that based on our needs and our thoughts, right? So I have a history of people making judgments about me, so I may hear a judgment even when there may not particularly be one on the part of the person who's speaking.
Yes, and it also gets more complicated where sometimes you have a body language or you raise your eyebrow and they see that raise of eyebrow and they interpret that that particular person interprets that eyebrow as being something that it's not meant to be. So therefore, it's very important to really check in all the time and really have a level playing field, that you're both communicating at a very ease and flow, and you know exactly what they're thinking, they know what you're thinking, and they'll, perhaps if they don't know about nonviolent communication, they will start checking in with you too, because they'll hear you saying that and doing it. So perhaps you'll be setting an example for them.
Well, you know where it can get really dicey, you remind me now too, we all have our blind spots, right? So we're really here, we're talking about needs that are conscious, right? So we want to get really dicey, we get into subconscious needs that we may not even be aware are operating. All right, so and I think I've mentioned to you in some of our previous conversations, you know, I dabble as a hobby in screenwriting, and that's one of the things that makes for great drama. Now, in nonviolent communication, you know, Marshall's motive was to understand violence, right, and nonviolence, and what drives people to be violent and act like that. In movies, in dramas, we want that, right? We want conflict. We want all that drama. That's what makes it exciting. Part of what makes an exciting story. So part of the formula for creating that is you have two people under pressure with conscious and subconscious needs that are pressing, and it's time and space limited. Go. You know,
Okay.
That's how you create drama. That's how you create conflict. So,
well, on that note,
real life.
On that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for being on the Art of Conscious Living TV and talking about this very, very important subject of the beautiful way of speaking and finding out what is alive in each other, what is the language, I call it the language of love, the nonviolent communication. And I thank you, Ken, very much, and I'd like to pick up and invite you again in a further show, and we have so much more to talk about. But thank you very, very much. I'm very honored and very pleased to speak with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And from the Art of Conscious Living, do take care of yourselves and take care of others.